Right. So welcome to you all. Special welcome to Kevin, who is so kind to talk to us today from the United States, from Ohio, where he is professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University. Many of you know his work, which covers quite a bit, a number of areas, questions of religion and political and public life, questions of economic and social justice, questions of public reason and public justifiability. So the two of us meet occasionally discussing these issues. And of course, what is of special interest to us today, he's one of the leading political philosophers working on trust. Let me just mention a few of his books and most important publications. There's on the topic of liberalism and religion, liberal politics and public faith, which appeared in 2014. Then two books very relevant to our topics. One is right here, called Must Politics Be War? Restoring Our Trust in the Open Society, came out in 2019 with OUP. Also OUP is his book, Trust in a Polarized Age, very much to the topic of interest to us. And then forthcoming is Illiberal Perfectionism. Lots of other books he edited, which I won't mention, but I will mention the one on social trust, which appeared last year. Many articles on the topics in the areas that I mentioned in great journals. So Kevin, it's a great pleasure to have you with us. Thanks for doing this, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me out, and to all of you who came. So my official remarks will basically be based on this handout that I'm hopefully putting in the chat right now. So again, I don't have the very long remarks. I wasted a minute or two, but not too much. So I thought I'd just give you some background on kind of how I came to work on trust and then where the project's going now, because I think it'll help to kind of focus what I'm talking about and why. So, you know, my earliest work was on kind of the role of religion in liberal democratic life. And I was working within, and still do, within the public reason framework, particularly in the US. Rawls's view, for instance, which is characterized as kind of hostile to religion, that isn't really true. It's actually, I think when you understand it, fairly accommodating, but I do think it causes some issues. And I do argue against a kind of Rawlsian duty of civility for citizens. That was actually fairly uncommon 8 to 10 years ago, but that the position of sort of giving up on restraint is something that's been taken up by a number of people since then. You know, what happened was that I kind of realized, well, you know, the problems posed by religion were just problems posed by what, you know, Rawls called comprehensive doctrines. And so they're going, all of this stuff is going to apply to secular ideologies too. But what if it applied to conceptions of justice? As we know, you know, Rawls, towards the very end of his career, was allowing reasonable pluralism to apply to justice to some extent as he did with conceptions of the good. And so I thought, well, what if we start treating egalitarianism and libertarianism and so on as in the same kind of way? Right? We can't base a society's stability or its moralized stability for the right reasons on any particular ideology. And that raised a series of really interesting puzzles. One of which was, well, okay, you know, these different ideologies have different conceptions of citizenship. So, you know, what a classical liberal thinks is involved in citizenship, and what a deliberative or, you know, say what a social democrat thinks is involved in citizenship, like say a Deweyan, it's very, very different, right? Classical liberals will say there's no duty to vote because a Deweyan's going to think of democracy as a way of life. So a vast range. So if, you know, citizenship isn't like the uniting moral relationship that we bear to one another in a publicly justified polity, what is? And I just didn't think that thicker relationships like like civic friendship were going to do the job. So we might look for a thinner relationship, but it can't be one that's purely instrumental rationality, right? It can't just be we see each other as non-moral agents that we can exchange with. So Jerry Gauss, my dissertation advisor, often used a phrase for this that he called moral relations. You really work at that idea out directly. But it's something like a kind of minimally Kantian attitude towards others. That is, we see other people as sources of their own reasons, and as being able to act not just from instrumental rationality, but for moral considerations themselves. So we see others as capable of taking the participant stance. Okay, so so then the question became, okay, well, if we're going to sustain these moral relations, what are they? Which relations are these? And Jerry had this little list, very short little list, love, friendship, and trust. I think, okay, well, love and friendship is great. He'd written a lot on that. But I kind of seized on this trust word. And I thought, actually, social contract tradition in general is not thinking a whole lot about trust directly. It'll sort of pop up here and pop up there. It's actually dramatically present in Locke's second treatise. The idea of a public trust is just everywhere. But then it occurred to me, well, look, I mean, here's the cool thing on focusing on trust. A lot of people are studying it empirically. And so we aren't just going to have to kind of spin our wheels conceptually, like we could actually make contact with what institutions actually promote trust or not. Now, of course, they can't promote trust in any way at all. They have to promote trust kind of for the right reasons. And so we wanted to see which institutions could be publicly justified. And those were the ones that would maintain trust for the right reasons. But it left open the question of, well, will they maintain trust in the real world, right? So if you think about the social contract as about sustaining trust between diverse perspectives, there's actually two questions. One is, does it rationally sustain trust between perspectives? That is, does each person have sufficient reason to endorse certain rules and then to trust each other on the basis of their endorsement and compliance of those rules? And then we can ask the empirical question, does liberalism or liberal order, even if it can be publicly justified, sustain liberal democratic order in the real world? Now, those, one's a sort of fully normative question, although I treat it as one of non-ideal theory, and the other is a question more in political economy. But I argue, and they roughly line up with my two trust books. So Must Politics Be War is an argument that liberalism is uniquely publicly justified because of its capacity to rationally sustain trust between diverse perspectives. Trust in a Polarized Age answers the empirical questions. It says, okay, do liberal democratic institutions actually promote social trust and trust in institutions? Okay. And, I argue yes. And this paper today goes through a number of the kind of conceptual developments I worked in to try to integrate the philosophical understanding of trust, with political science and economics. Because that's kind of the synthetic project I'm working on. And now, Christina Beakieri and I, Penn, have received a Templeton grant to study trust norms and poverty. And it's important for me to kind of return to the study of political trust, in part because there are more and more groups studying it in light of COVID. Because COVID policy and trust in institutions seem to be really quite well connected, and the effectiveness of COVID policy. The OECD, for instance, is a series of guidelines now, extensive guidelines about how to measure institutional trust. And so, I want to do my duty to keep up with the philosophy and the political science, the economics. And so that's what I'm going to do now, is to try to give you a sense of what we're talking about when we're talking about political trust. Okay. So yeah, my goal here on the handout, I say roughly, political trust is trust placed in governmental bodies to follow what I'll call institutional norms, achieving efficiency, acting for moral concern. Trusters resent or are indignant with violations of those norms. So there are some people that will tell me, and I'll repeat this point in a moment, that, well, states aren't moral agents, and so the reactive attitudes are inappropriate, right? Resentment, indignation are inappropriate. I just don't think that's democratic practice. In fact, I think, the application of reactive attitudes to institutions is so deep set that it would be revisionary, I think, to deny it, and we should prefer theories that help us to make sense of it. And the goal then is to present a notion of political trust that's both philosophically satisfying and that captures the measurement of political trust in the empirical literature. So this requires me kind of build up with 6 concepts, but the progression, I think, makes a certain kind of sense. So I think of trust, as many people do, and I think this is probably the dominant position, as a 3-place relation. So A trusts B to phi, right? It isn't just A trusts B, or in one weird person's case, A trusts. And when I say I trust you, what I think I'm doing when I say that, say to a friend, is that I trust them to follow a series of norms, right? Norms that are oftentimes just built into what Vallier calls a script. Now, trust is not just a prediction. It's widespread agreement in the trust literature that trust is a form of reliance. Now, some people deny this form of reliance. So A has to have some goal, very broadly construed. It could be follow the categorical imperative. Like, it doesn't have to be, achieve a certain concrete outcome. And then you have to think that B's phiing is necessary or helpful for achieving that goal, because you're relying on them. You've got a goal and you need their help to achieve it. Now, I call B a participant because, again, we're assuming we're acting from the Straussian participant stance. That's, I think, a presupposition of our trust practices. If you want to see this, just imagine what happens when trust is disappointed or betrayed. Right? You can see this kind of Straussian character. Trust is a kind of moralized, second personal attitude. Okay. You have to think that the other person's willing to help you achieve the goal. That's obvious enough. But also that they're competent, right? Because someone may be willing, but it's hard to trust them if you think they just can't do it, right? Now, the next condition is the most controversial one, but there is a kind of broad consensus in the trust literature. It isn't, it isn't very broad, but that to trust someone, you have to think that they act from some kind of moral concern. Maybe you think they have to conduct themselves in a way that displays goodwill towards you, or at least does not display bad will. So you can imagine, I can depend on you to engage in certain lines of conduct, but you're just trying to lull me into a false sense of security, right? And then you're going to dig in the knife or something, right? You're going to betray me. That, I think, if we learn this, right, we can't really trust. Or if we learn, for instance, that people in our community are all automata, right? They don't really truly act at all. Okay, then I think, we go back into reliability mode. We're outside the participant stance. We don't see people as acting for moral considerations. Now, I try to broaden this to include that people are acting from moral reasons broadly. They might be, oh, I know that person has a very strict moral code, and or something like that. But I kind of leave open here what moral reasons are if I get convinced to restrict the scope. I also think that when we trust others, we typically trust them to follow a kind of social norm. And the reason for this, and I'll explain what a social norm is more officially in a moment, is that we aren't just trusting people to follow descriptive norms, because those aren't norms that we think people sort of morally ought to follow. For instance, it's a little odd to trust people not to wear white after Labor Day, as we don't in the U.S. Or not to wear a hat in the wrong period of time, unless, of course, say we've promised to do so. It's also the case that I think we trust people to follow norms that we think are a matter of something like common knowledge, where we all kind of believe in them and expect others to follow them. Suppose I just have a personal moral norm. Don't eat pork because God has forbidden it. But you don't accept that norm. Usually trust is not targeted at such personal norms. They're usually shared norms backed by similar expectations. So that's kind of my general account of interpersonal trust. But let me talk a bit about a social norm. Here I'm just following Vallier, but I think the kind of ANU trust view, you can, if you work out the common terms, I don't know how far apart they are in terms of how much it matters, but I'll just go with her view. So a social norm, there is some kind of pattern of behavior that everyone knows exists, okay, or at least is understood to be a practice. And for Vallier, these are norms that we conditionally prefer to follow. You know, they oftentimes come at some cost to us. You think about the norms of traffic. That's when we're engaged in responsible driving. There's a host of norms that are slightly annoying. They're not just conventions where we follow them purely out of self-interest, like driving on in our case, in the American case, on the right-hand side of the road. We do that just because if we didn't, we would immediately get in a wreck. That's a convention. But say allowing people to merge into oncoming traffic, I could just not allow that. But I would be kind of a jerk for not doing it. And I expect others to do it for me. And we feel a certain kind of indignation and resentment when those norms are violated. But, you know, I only sort of prefer to follow it as long as others do. I have to have two sets of expectations that back it. I have to think that others will follow the norm. That is, it's a norm, right? And it's backed by normative expectations. And this is a little more complex. You have to think that others think that you should follow the norm. Okay. Now, Vallier here allows that normative expectations can be backed by a prudential ought or a moral ought. Prudential ought being just it's wise or profitable for me to follow the norm, versus the moral ought where it's simply something that's required of me, morally speaking. I mean, I won't try to characterize the moral ought here, but I think we understand that there's a difference between the moral and prudential ought, at least on the surface. So what I want to call a moral rule is a social norm that's backed by a moral ought, that it grounds a practice of reciprocal obligation, and there are violations of which typically evoke the negative reactive attitudes of resentment and indignation, as well as practices of blame and punishment. Now, Christina allows that a moral rule is a kind of, as I define it, is a species of social norm. But I think that it is odd to talk about trusting someone to follow a norm for purely personal prudential reasons. Like, I'm afraid of getting caught if I violate. That strikes a lot of people's ears again a little odd. That again, trust is this kind of sort of Darwinian second personal attitude and involves acting from kinds of moral considerations. There are other people who think this is kind of making trust too vaunted, too complex. But I think the more we learn about the kind of automaticity of much of our moral psychology, and and particularly the idea of human beings as having evolved as reciprocal altruists, I do think there is an important sense in which kind of the human moral psychological package is that we are a little deontological, we are a little kind of semi-Kantians. I mean, we're not, you know, again, nothing very elaborate in terms of a decision procedure, though I do think, and I guess this audience may be more sympathetic with the idea that certain of our practices, perhaps our discursive practices, do suppose a kind of more complex constructivist procedure for arriving at certain moral principles. But regardless, I don't think that supposing that trust is a kind of moralized attitude is adding more content than is already there, or something along those lines. If you look at the trust data, you look at the surveys, it's just moralized language through and through in many cases. Is the government fair? Does it act with integrity? Can you trust most people to do the right thing? Do people, you know, or it's all of the things that are being studied or asked about are usually use deeply moralized language. Okay, so then what's social trust? Now, the trouble with social trust is that there aren't really accounts. I mean, there's tons of accounts of norms, not tons, but there are a lot of accounts of norms. There's tons of accounts of interpersonal trust in philosophy. But in terms of actually defining social trust, okay, which is widely studied all over the world and has been studied for decades, There's not really been, in my experience, very many analyses of what it would be. So I've got a kind of lengthy definition here, but it maps on to the idea of trust. And so you should be able to follow it if you've got the previous concepts. Okay. So a public exhibits social trust, that is, but not as a single agent. That is, we have social trust when each member of the public, it sort of depends on a representative member of that public. So it's participant members. Okay. So we're dealing with, the kind of those. If we know that some members of the public are psychopathic, right, that they have that kind of deficit of taking the participant stance, that this makes it more complicated. But so I just limiting this to participant members, generally believe that other participants, which again, most people take to be just about everybody, are necessary or helpful for achieving one another's goals. Okay, so that lines up with the competence condition, and that most or all members are generally willing, that we're depending on others, the reliability condition, that people are willing and able, right, the willingness and competent conditions to do their part to achieve those goals, knowingly or unknowingly, because with social trust, we're trusting strangers, okay? And so I might trust you to do something even if you're not even aware of who I am. So a very, very common case of this is trusting other people to be good drivers, to follow basic rules. I may not even see in people's cars. I interact with them one time, but there is still, I think, a very clear sense in which I trust them in this kind of moralized sense that when they break the traffic rule or the traffic law, I feel the negative reactive attitudes and I want to blame and punish. And it's instant, right? Just think about the way if someone misbehaves in traffic, it's someone you don't know, you were depending on them not to break the rule in some way, or at least others were, right? And if you're the target of the wrongdoing, you experience resentment. If you see someone else as the target of the mistreatment, then you may feel indignation. And this can oftentimes be, quite extraordinary, right? I mean, someone's nasty enough, and that can create a conflict very quickly. Now, when we socially trust, we're trusting people to follow our moral rules. And again, if you look at the data, the way that things are measured, I think this fits the data, but I also think it is intuitively true that what we're doing is we're depending on people to follow like commonly understood and adopted norms that are backed by a moral law that license a certain kind of moral sanction when violated. Now, this last part of the definition again, appeals to this broad notion of moral reasons. If I get convinced that this needs to be filled out in a certain way, I could be. But here I want to allow for, say, two kinds of cases. One where we just sort of bear people generally goodwill. But another is I just know that someone, say, is a member of a group that has very high ethical standards, right? And they just kind of do what's expected of them because they're very convicted by their sense of duty. They don't necessarily have attitudes about you or me, but we know they're kind of upstanding or something like that. Now that might be a person we can trust. It would be weird for such a person not to bear us good or bad will, though. So you might still think that some kind of goodwill condition is essential. But again, I don't want to lock myself down to that unless I need to. Now, this sufficient to motivate compliance thing, I am willing to bend a bit on. A bit. Suppose you have moral reasons to act in the way that others trust you to act, but they're just really weak and they're always overridden. And then someone learns that, right? I mean, suppose you're just so overcome by greed that if you weren't greedy, you would eagerly do what you're trusted to do out of moral concern for others. But it just so happens that your financial interests are opposed to them and they always outweigh them. Now, I think if you know that about a person, it is hard to trust them. You think, look, they're just going to betray me for money. They may have some moral motivation in the pipeline, but it just doesn't get there. But take another case. Imagine that you learn that you can generally count on your coworkers to do their jobs and to help you out. But some days they come in and, you know, they're not acting for moral concern. They just don't want to get fired that day, or something along those lines. And so people's moral motivations oftentimes sort of carry them into action, but oftentimes do not. Then I want to say, well, the moral reasons would carry them along, but maybe some days they don't carry them along. Can I trust such a person? Could I trust members of society I know that are kind of morally mediocre in this sense? I think so. So, I mean, again, if you want to push me to relax this condition a bit, I think that's okay. All right. So that's what I think of as social trust or generalized trust. And I think, you know, if you look at a lot of the standard cases, you know, even trust, I mean, the trust game in the labs are more complex about what people's actual motivations are. But if you look at the surveying, you can capture all this pretty quickly. Just an example. One proxy for trust judgments is trust behavior. And particularly in following moral norms where it's hard to punish people for violations, maybe because they go above and beyond. So the likelihood of, say, wallet return, how likely are people to return a wallet that's sort of left behind? Another example is this cool study of UN diplomats and how often they commit parking violations. Because they have diplomatic immunity, they can't actually be fined. But the people who come from the high social trust countries just basically never get fined. They never break the rules. And so that's another example. You may think, well, you've got social trust here, people, but these are cases of sort of moralized behavior. These are things, well, you know, honor the countries that you live in, don't break their laws, or, you know, it's really good to bring somebody's wallet back to them because, boy, you'd hate it if you lost yours. But today, so I want to give you the notion of social trust, but I think political trust is trust in a kind of subset of the public, particularly a subset of the public that is organized into an institution that's supposed to engage in certain outputs for certain kinds, based on certain kinds of procedures. Okay. But what we do when we politically trust is we trust people to follow a particular kind of moral rule. Okay. Now, again, the pushback here is just that governments are not agents at all, or they're agents in the sense that robots are agents. They just produce certain outcomes. And now again, you know, maybe there are folks who want to push me on this, but I am working from the intuition of democratic peoples, which is that at least the leadership of these organizations can be held accountable for failures. Maybe there's an error theory about all of this. Maybe our frustration with our governments over COVID policies is just erroneous, and because we're holding groups accountable that cannot be held accountable. But I just don't think that's true. And I actually I'm not sure that's going to be y'all's main objection anyway. So an institutional rule or moral rules widely believed apply to a government body, that the public predicts the body will typically obey, that most everyone believes the body ought to obey. So institutional rules or moral rules applied to social subgroups, and they specify a telos or end for that subgroup. So just take, for instance, the American Environmental Protection Agency, right? They're supposed to keep, say, endangered species from going extinct. And they're supposed to do so in ways that are kind of proper, right? I mean, they're not supposed to sort of like buy off or engage in corrupt relationships with people who might drive certain species to extinction. But they are supposed to respond to the public expectation that they protect endangered species. This is also the case, say, with public health institutions. We both expect them to produce good outcomes, but we also expect them to, and we'll see this with political trust, I think we also, we expect them to act from a kind of moral concern, as I'll say in a moment, but we expect them to produce certain outputs. So what do we do when we trust a governmental agency? We're trusting them to produce certain kinds of outputs, but also in a for particular kinds of reasons. And in fact, it turns out in the political trust measurements, it looks like just about everybody has a kind of two value, or at least two value function. One of the things that we value is that can affect our institutional trust levels is just whether we think these institutions produce the relevant outcomes that they're supposed to produce. And then the other is about, whether they do so in a way that's fair, and whether they respond to public input, which is something I try to capture. But what's very clear is that when you trust an institution, you're trusting it to produce an outcome. Now, when you socially trust, that isn't true, unless you construe outcome in a very broad sense of the term, right? We generally trust people to follow a panoply of social norms. But with an institutional rule, we're expecting a group to produce an outcome, some kind of desired outcome. Okay, so then what's political trust? Well, we trust government, we trust a governmental institution to the extent that, those involved in the moral game, right, think that the government officials are necessary or helpful for achieving public political goals, right? It would, if you had the institution of the enemy of the people, right, and trusting it's a sort of bizarre thing to do, right? You want the institution to be trying to achieve certain shared goals, and that many of these government officials are willing and able to do their part to achieve those goals, knowingly or unknowingly. They may follow rules that have good effects without sort of seeing all the effects. By following institutional rules where moral reasons are perhaps, say, generally efficient, or generally sufficient, or generally present to motivate compliance with those rules. And this explains, I think, judgments of trustworthiness of government bodies. I think this is very clear in the recent OECD report, that we expect, for instance, government agencies to produce certain kinds of health outcomes, but we expect them to do so with a kind of regard for others. So the broad expectation among not just democratic peoples, but many peoples where there's not democracy at the top, but there's public consultation like China, is that the governmental agencies should, for instance, listen to the people they govern. So maybe an agency would be one that just produces the own outcome because they're an epistocratic organization or something like that. But it looks like there are certain moral expectations of the body other than it produced certain outcomes, that it produced them in certain ways. Again, by listening to the people and the outcomes. Also, there's an expectation in basically every country that it meets some kind of equality condition, that the distribution of resources is fair, or something to that effect. Sorry, shoot, my office light goes off sometimes, and I don't move enough. So it's also the case that I think this explains our tendency to be disappointed in, or angry, resentful, or indignant with governmental bodies. That, again, is a deep part of democratic practice. And the moral anger over COVID policy right now is palpable. And I think we're in a particular political moment where it feels, at least, that those in public health officials are kind of deeply responsible for failures or perhaps for successes. So we do engender these negative reactive attitudes when the government fails to produce the right outcome, or particularly if it fails in the way it's supposed to produce that outcome, if it does so corruptly, if it does so without listening to people, or something along those lines. So empirically, we're most upset with governmental bodies when they're publicly corrupt and fail to produce valued outcomes like economic growth, proper compensation, equality. And we do reduce our political trust, it looks like, when we think the government's not producing the output, and we think it's not producing it out of some kind of regard for most people, right? That's why it matters that they be fair. That's why it matters that they not be corrupt. I mean, learning about a public institution being corrupt in the sense that people are using government funds for private purposes, take that as just being kind of like the paradigm of bad governmental behavior, is that you are acting for private and not public purposes. You're using governmental institutions for that. That, when people discover that, will lose trust. So one of the things that happened in Europe to political trust was that the United States already had very low trust in Congress, at least. And so by the time of the financial crisis, we weren't going to go down a whole bunch. But the financial crisis did, at least from what I've seen, reduce political trust in a number of many European countries. And on top of that, it took a long time to recover. Pre-COVID, it looked like it recovered. It took about 10 years. So there could be salient public events. In the United States, the combination of the Vietnam War and Watergate was one of them. It seems to have just kicked trust in government in the gut. But the sense was, look, you have these elites, you know, they're very wealthy. Their investment practices screwed everything up. And then the government cut spending in ways that continued to favor them. These are called, you know, the austerity measures. So this was a case where people thought, look, people are not just corrupt, but they are only caring for the folks at the top. And we perhaps didn't think that they would do this. We thought that under normal circumstances, they cared about us and so would make sure we were all protected. You know, I mean, just as an aside, I mean, a lot of it just has to do with the differences in the U.S. and Europe were interesting here. Actually, Pippa Norris has argued at some length that the political trust has actually not fallen terribly much in Europe in certain ways. But it's fascinating actually as you start to see the political trust numbers now with COVID. They went up very, very high very quickly following the beginning of the pandemic, which is consistent with rally around the flag effects that we see, say, during a war. So trust in government after 9/11 in the United States just skyrocketed. But by the time of the Iraq war, it came down pretty quickly. So one thing that will happen is people will give a lot of slack to their leaders when the leaders have some clear goal and seem to be trying to achieve that goal. And they seem to be being, you know, team leader, right? Like they're actually helping people organize in the community. But then if they fail, right, repeatedly, then people think, wow, you know, this is a very large failure. And so this person can't be trusted. Okay, so that's pretty much what I wanted to say. Hopefully that'll give you a better sense of the project. When doing empirical work, of course, not all of this can be operationalized, obviously. But I think it will, when we look at what the measurements consist in, if we have a respectable concept, we can say, okay, look, they actually are measuring this thing that we think we understand, what it is, you know, what it is. So let me give you an example of how this might fail, just for you to see it. So the most common trust question in surveys is on social trust. It's called the Rosenberg question. And the Rosenberg question is, can most people be trusted, or can you never be too careful in dealing with people? So Gallup in the United States and the American National Election Survey, General Social Survey, actually, American National Election Survey has been asking that question since the mid-1950s. The trust surveying actually began much later in most of Europe. But these days, the Eurobarometer and the European Social Survey are just really, really comprehensive with respect to these measures. But, you know, we were just talking to some of the OECD surveying bodies earlier this week. And one of the researchers said that he was skeptical about the Rosenberg question because he thought it measured carefulness rather than trust. Because, I mean, think about the question. Can most people be trusted, and can you never be too careful in dealing with people? And you might think carefulness and trust are kind of are different things. Well, it's true they're different things. But the vast majority of trust researchers say that actually the Rosenberg question really holds up against a lot of challenges, and has for some time. But you can kind of see why you might think a survey didn't measure the thing that you were saying it was measuring. So that's, I think, a way that you might go wrong, right? A way that you might, you know, fail to to capture the concept. Now, what I'm doing here is probably wrong, because it's extremely hard to formulate a concept that is philosophically and empirically accurate at the same time. It's just extremely difficult to do. And so this is almost certainly wrong. But what I hope to have sort of sold you on today is that it's a good first approximation. Because I do think that, we need an interdisciplinary study of trust. I think you all surely agree with that. And so my hope is, even if, there's problems here, that we could see the value in trying to bring together sort of literature on interpersonal trust, moral psychology, and modern sort of analytic moral psychology, with a lot of the sort of trust literature as it's actually measured. So even if I've got it wrong, hopefully we can sort of figure out a way to get it right if we can. So, okay, with that, I'll stop. Trying to stay under 45 minutes. Said a little bit more than I intended, but hopefully I think it was useful, perhaps. So thank you all. I'm very appreciative.